Joining me now, as he does each and every week, is Sky News Australia's media watchdog columnist Gerard Henderson. Gerard, you've noticed this week that the left-wing media in Australia seems to be giving the Teals a bit of a free run. Here's Network 10's The Project doing their best last Sunday.
Do you think that there is this growing like a growing appetite towards independence then? And then are you comfortable in being the kind of face of that new wave?
It's going to be a big challenge, isn't it, in this election? But it's also a challenge for the media as well. Like the fact that we call them the Teals, that's not what they call themselves. It's just because we're like, I can't deal with all these independent people. Let's make up a term for them. Like they don't actually necessarily sit down together, come up with the same policies. Like we just can't deal with all these different independents, can we?
Gerard, we can't just call them the Teals. What's your reaction?
Well, that's Craig Rewcastle at the end there. They call themselves the Teals. They pose together in photographs. They tend to operate together. They were essentially got into Parliament because they were funded by the multi-billionaire Simon Holmes à Court. They pretty well act together. They're all in Parliament because they got preferences from the Labor Party and all the Greens. And that's if they return at the next election, that'll be the same again. So when you look at it, they sound like a party, they look like a party, but according to Craig, they're just a couple of people. So what you had there in these instances is essentially the ABC, or the Project in this instance. Craig Rewcastle's on the ABC, but supporting a Teal candidate in a seat in Queensland, in McPherson, and a seat in Victoria in Wadden. And what happened on the Project was that the sitting National Liberal Party member in Queensland and the Liberal Party member in Victoria weren't even mentioned, or they were vaguely mentioned, but they weren't interviewed. It was like they weren't there. It was like these new Teals were going to suddenly come in and win seats in Parliament, just sort of by themselves and without any kind of opposition. But the idea that they're not a party, well, really, they are a party.
Yeah, I think they probably are, for quacks like one, right? And then obviously the ABC senior reporter Laura Tingle, she did a story on 7:30 about Australia's involvement in Ukraine. And guess who she interviewed for their opinion?
It's one thing for the Europeans to stand up for Ukraine, but another for Australia, particularly given the past caution about taking a different position to President Trump on almost anything. And while the government's language may reverberate in Washington, at home, opinion polls pointing to a likely minority government suggest views on the crossbench may need to be taken into consideration. The MP for Goldstein, Zoe Daniel, says it is time for some plain talking with our ally.
I don't think it's sustainable to just hope that this situation will go away and that we can walk on eggshells around Donald Trump for the next 4 years in the hope that he won't impose tariffs on our key exports because we defy him in some way.
Now, Gerard, everyone is entitled to an opinion, but Tingle asking her former ABC colleague Zoe Daniel and TLMP, what do you make of that?
Well, a coincidence, obviously. You'll note that Zoe Daniel gets a lot of coverage on ABC television and Radio National in particular, 7:30 here. And what's happening really is that ABC people like Laura Tingle and their producers are going to their former colleague to get an opinion. Now, on my last count, there's around 14 independent on the crossbench. That's a lot of people. But Zoe Daniel's one of 14, but you rarely see the others. You only really see the Teals who are in Parliament. You don't see the others. But what happens when Parliament resumes, as we know, everyone gets one vote. But Zoe Daniel's certainly getting special treatment on the ABC. And the other point to bear in mind is she's on a narrow margin in Goldstein. She won on the back of Labor and Greens preferences. Her margin's around 3%. It's not necessarily clear that she'll be back in Parliament. She may well win, I don't know. She may not win, but she's certainly getting a lot of free kicks in front of an open goal from her former ABC colleagues, because it's never explained why out of the 14 you pick Zoe Daniel. I don't know why that's the case, or Allegra Spender gets a very good run as well, but it's not clear why the others aren't mentioned, because if an incoming government, Labor or the coalition, has to form a majority government out of the minority people, or preside over a minority government, as I said before, Zoe Daniels got one vote and everyone else has got one vote who's there, and we don't even know how many people are going to be there. But these are really soft interviews where people like Zoe Daniel are never challenged by their former ABC colleagues, just never challenged at all.
And, you know, if they are going to form part of any minority government, what they actually think is really important. So you think that some of those questions would be a bit tougher. And now finally, Gerard, you notice yet another example, but this time the ABC peddling a bit more climate fear-mongering in case we haven't had enough. This time ABC Radio National breakfast host Sally Sara. Here is how she ended her interview with the Federal Minister for Emergency Management.
That's Jenny McAllister there, the Federal Emergency Management Minister, and of course previously was in the climate change portfolio, now very much on the front line.
They really can't help themselves, can they, Gerard?
No. Well, the front line is like World War One, and you know, on the front line. But as we know, in that area of southern Queensland and northern New South Wales, there have been cyclones and this kind of adverse weather at least 3 times in the last 60 years. So it's not really a front line. It's not like this, because if it's a front line tomorrow, what was it in 1954? I mean, no one even thought about it in this way. I mean, what we know is that there's no evidence, as far as I'm aware, that connects any cyclone with climate change. So what's happening is it's just sort of more emergency thinking, panic, hyperbole, like someone, a minister in the Albanese government heading off to the front line. Well, people on the front line used to fire weapons. I mean, that minister, Jenny McAllister, is going there to try and help out, but I mean, it's hardly a front line. But when you sort of build all these up, there's a climate change catastrophe, there's a front line on which it must be fought, provided you forget the other front lines on which it was never fought when it happened once before. So again, it's sort of this very much ABC line, and it's very hard to find anyone in the whole of the taxpayer-funded public broadcaster who would disagree with the kind of position that Sally Sara is putting. It's sort of part of a quasi-religious, secular religious belief in the ABC, which is never challenged. And so when people say, oh, I'm off to the front line, people assume, well, there is a front line, but there isn't one. So there you go.
No, and you think, you know, when we're right in the middle of these things, that we would be a bit more practical about them. Gerard, thank you so much for your insights this evening.